Structured Query Language, or SQL, is a database language designed for managing data held in a relational database management system. SQL was initially developed by IBM in the early 1970s, date 1986. The initial version, called SQL, or Structured English Query Language, was designed to manipulate and retrieve data stored in IBM's quasi-relational database management system, System R. Then in the late 1970s, Relational Software Incorporated, which is now Oracle Corporation, introduced the first commercially available implementation of SQL, Oracle V2 for VAX computers. Many of the currently available relational DBMSs, such as Oracle Database, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, IBM DB2, IBM Informix, and Microsoft Access, use SQL. In a DBMS, the SQL database language is used to create the database and table structures, perform basic data management chores like add, delete, and modify, and perform complex queries to transform raw data into useful information. In this chapter, we will focus on using SQL to create the database and table structures, mainly using SQL as a data definition language, or DDL. The optional column constraints are null, not null, unique, primary key, and default, used to initialize a value for a new record. The column constraint null indicates that null values are allowed, which means that a row can be created without a value for this column. The column constraint not null indicates that a value must be supplied when a new row is created. Table constraints are identified by the constraint keyword and can be used to implement various constraints described in the following. Identity constraint. We can use the optional column constraint identity to provide a unique incremental value for that column. Identity columns are often used with the primary key constraints to serve as the unique row identifier for the table. The identity property can be assigned to a column with a tiny int, small int, decimal, or numeric data type. This constraint generates sequential numbers, does not enforce entity integrity, only one column can have the identity property, must be defined as an integer, numeric, or decimal data type, cannot update a column with the identity property, cannot contain null values, cannot bind defaults and default constraints to the column. For identity, seed increment. Seed is the initial value of the identity column. Increment is the value to add to the last increment column. Unique constraint. The unique constraint prevents duplicate values from being entered into a column. Both PK and unique constraints are used to enforce entity integrity. Multiple unique constraints can be defined for a table. When a unique constraint is added to an existing table, the existing data is always validated. A unique constraint can be placed on columns that accept nulls. Only one row can be null. A unique constraint automatically creates a unique index on the selected column. Foreign key constraint. The foreign key, or FK constraint, defines a column or a combination of columns whose values match the primary key, or PK, of another table. Values in an FK are automatically updated when the PK values in the associated table are updated or changed. FK constraints must reference PK or the unique constraint of another table. The number of columns for FK must be same as PK or unique constraint. If the with no check option is used, the FK constraint will not validate existing data in a table. No index is created on the columns that participate in an FK constraint. Now let's talk about check constraint. The check constraint restricts values that can be entered into a table. And let's talk about default constraint. The default constraint is used to supply a value that is automatically added for a column if the user does not supply one. A column can have only one default. The default constraint cannot be used on columns with a timestamp data type or identity property. Default constraints are automatically bound to a column when they are created. It can contain search conditions similar to a where clause. It can reference columns in the same table. The data validation rule for a check constraint must evaluate to a Boolean expression. It can be defined for a column that has a rule bound to it.